Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kezia Rust. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa. And I'm delighted to welcome you all today to this webinar where we talk about unlocking market intelligence for the affordable housing sector. I'm here with my colleagues, with Ben Atkinson from Reall, with Chris Garbers from 71.4, with Ilana Melzer from 71.4, Claudio Ascioli, who is a board member of CAHF and is, I'm sure, well known to very many people, and Maria Hoek-Smit as well, who is with the Wharton School International Housing Finance Program. We are all very excited to talk to you today about the data agenda for housing in Africa and about some work that we've been doing over the last, I think now 2 years, to really pull together data in affordable housing, specifically in Africa, though some of us are looking further afield as well. Let's just start with some introductions. I've done a very quick run through, but let me just invite my colleagues and panelists to introduce yourselves. Ben, let's start with you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Great to see so many people joining us today. So I am Ben Atkinson. I'm the Research, Evidence and Learning Manager at Reall. Reall is a UK-based investor and innovator in affordable housing working across Africa and Asia. I've been leading this project from Reall's side, first of all in Africa, and as Kezia mentioned, now taking that to other countries too. And yeah, excited to talk about that further over the next 90 minutes.
Fantastic, thank you. Ilana.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ilana. I work at a company called 71.4. We've been working with CAHF and Reall over the past
forever,
really a couple of years now, to populate some of the
Sounds like Ilana's struggling a little bit with connection. Chris, do you want to come in?
Yes, hi. Good afternoon or morning or evening, depending where you're tuning in from, I suppose. My name is Chris Garbers. I'm a data scientist with 71.4. And as Ilana said, we've been working together with CAHF and Reall for, it has been about 2 years now. And it's very nice to, on this data agenda, and it's very nice to getting to the point now where, you know, it's dissemination and we're starting to get to the juicy part of the work, I would say. So excited to have you guys here and to share some of the things that we've learned through the process today.
Fantastic, thanks, Chris. Maria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Maria Hoek-Smit. As Kezia mentioned, I have been leading the International Housing Finance Program of the Wharton School. But more importantly, in this context, I established HOFINET, which is a data collection network focused on the housing finance and housing sector, mostly housing finance.
Thank you very much. And Claudio?
Yeah, I'm Claudio Ascioli. Recently have left UN Habitat after 12 years coordinating the housing policy, the UN Housing Rights Program, and the advisory group on forced evictions to executive director, and working in the last 2 years for the European Union, GIZ, and recently doing a work on evaluating the participatory slum upgrading programming carried out and financed by the EU. So I'm a board member of CAHF since a few years back, and following very closely this important work, and I'm really looking forward to see how this is unpacking. So very happy to be here.
Super, thanks so much, Claudio. Thank you, everybody. Maybe just a bit of background about how we're going to manage the next hour and a half. I'm going to give a brief introduction about how we got here and kind of why we care. Then Ben is going to take us through a presentation of Reall's approach to the work. And then Chris and Ilana together are going to give a presentation on really what it all means, the whole effort of having collected the data and thinking about what that then means and how we take that forward. And then we've invited Maria and Claudio to really present their reflections on the work, perhaps have a bit of a conversation between themselves, and hopefully also with all of you responding to some of the comments that you raise, and I'll moderate that session. And then we'll have a look at some of the work that Reall's just recently produced, and we'll close. So please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat and put your questions into the chat so we can try and get those answered in the course of the next hour and a half. So this data agenda for Africa is something that the CAHF and I have been harping on about for a really long time. And so many of you, I'm sure, have heard me talk about how significant and important data is to functioning housing markets. And it really is an obvious point. It's fundamental to any sector. In order to make an investment, you need to know what you're investing in. So you better understand how it works and be able to consider what your risks are, consider what your returns are, and that will shape the character of the investment. In affordable housing, that's especially necessary because there are so many things about affordable housing that we presume even before we have the data in front of us. And that then shapes a whole lot of what we do and leads to poor market targeting in some instances, missing whole markets. What we've been trying to do at CAHF, and certainly this is also what Reall and 71.4 have been championing in their work, is really to bring evidence to these decisions and to these considerations so that we make good decisions that explicitly focus on the target market that we're interested in, that promotes investment that realizes real returns for the practitioners and real benefits for those for whom the services are being delivered. Now, we talk all the time about the fact that there's no data, and that's probably the most common sentence. And what I've learned possibly most from Maria originally, and Maria has been the great inspiration in this from I'm sure for many people here, and then also from Chris in his data collection and digging into this particular effort, is that the data does exist. There is data. There's lots of data. Regulators are collecting the data all the time because they have regulatory functions that they have to perform. National statistical offices collect data because they have certain obligations in terms of market information for the country. The private sector is producing data all the time, not necessarily collecting it, but certainly producing it just by virtue of being alive, of operating, and same goes for households and individuals. So the data landscape, there's lots of data. The real challenge is how we organize it and where we pull it from. So that's what this data agenda for Africa is all about. And we have organized it. And this is something that both Chris and Ben will go through as they describe the structure of the data agenda. We try to make it as simple as possible, and this dense, impossible to read slide suggests that it can't be that simple because there really is so much that we want to know about the whole housing sector and how it functions across the continent, and then in particular local places. The point of the data agenda, though, is that we can't do this by ourselves. And that's why I'm so glad that you are all here today. And I hope that you'll tell everybody who isn't here to also join in this data agenda, which is kind of like a movement, I'd like to say, where everybody who is producing data and information joins in the collective of organizing it so that we can share it for our mutual benefit. And that really is the purpose of this effort. So We've started to produce some material from the work. Reall will take you through what they've produced, and I think that their dashboard, which holds all of the data in a way that you can browse it or you can download it, is really very exciting. We've also put together quite detailed data landscape reports, which set out recommendations for the public sector practitioners and players in the markets in different countries to articulate specifically what are the things that, like, the Bank of Uganda can do, or what can the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics do? Are there particular interventions that can be made by particular players that doesn't actually stretch their mandate, but gives life to their mandate? That's what we're looking for here. And so all of this material is up on our website and on Reall's website. If you can't find it, just write to me and I'll share it with you, but it will be widely available. And we're just at the beginning. There's lots more that we'll be doing and creating, and we'll talk about that in the course of this morning as well, this afternoon, morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you are. So we've worked with lots of different parties, both in country and across. This is just a beginning list of those who were directly involved in the reports that are just published now. We also have reports that will be published very soon for Tanzania, for Cote d'Ivoire, and Morocco. We've been working in Rwanda as well, undertaking a similar exercise, and that will also be published so that we can now have a collective approach of what is the data landscape in each country, particular to that country, but as understood within a broad framework. And just to conclude, to share with you where we're going as CAHF with this and with all of our partners and with you, is to think about, well, how does this data agenda fit within our normal research agenda? And if you just take a look at on the right-hand side of this slide, our wider research activities, many of you are familiar with our yearbook, which provides a country focus, a broad overview of 55 countries, and that comes out every November. We also do a whole lot of research in terms of specific focused areas, whether it's around gender or affordability, housing economic value chain work. We work with specific organizations, or we work across the board. The data agenda for Africa is saying, okay, that will continue. CAHF will continue to do this kind of work. But now what we want to do as well is just recognize the simultaneous efforts of all of our partners and crowd those in. This is a crowdsourcing effort. And so the data landscape work and the market shaping indicators that we are presenting today are the 100, well, they were 117, pardon me, now they're 115, they change all the time. But those provide a public sector focus on what data is available from the public sector. And then what we'll be sharing with you in the coming months is some work that we're doing initially with FSD Africa Investments, Reall, and FSD Kenya, but more broadly than that as well, is an effort into open access to private sector data. And we're partnering with some key private sector players, notably International Housing Solutions in Kenya, Kwangu Kwaku in Kenya as well, to start to stimulate the collection and the curation of private sector developed data. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over now to Ben.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So let me just share my screen now. And I hope you can see that okay now. Sorry. Yeah, so good afternoon. As I said before, my name is Ben Atkinson. I'm the Research Evidence and Learning Manager at Reall. So Reall is an innovator and investor in affordable housing in Africa and Asia. We develop, refine, and share innovative housing models that unlock the political will, capital investment, and end-user finance needed to create conditions for hardworking families to secure homes. Through investing in housing projects and documenting the outputs and impacts, we prove the concept of commercially viable, climate-smart affordable housing, including the $10,000 home. Reall works with local partners who are experts in their respective markets. Partners include developers, fintech and proptech companies, end-user finance providers, research institutions, and NGOs. Since 1989, and working through our partners on the ground, Reall has provided over 80,000 new or upgraded homes and improved sanitation for over 200,000 households, targeting the bottom 40% of the income pyramid. Since 2001, we've operated under a more commercial approach, through which we've invested over $80 million to date in mainly loan finance across 160 plus projects. And through this constructed or improved around 25,000 homes, with over 5,000 in progress. We've worked in over 15 countries across Africa and Asia, and over the last 5 years, the cost of land and construction on our projects have averaged around $11,000 per home, far cheaper than most actors in the sector believe possible. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that as Reall, we have a lot of experience in working in these challenging contexts, and our partners have even more experience. We know how hard it is to break into many of these markets, and we have the benefits of being donor funded. Though we provide loans, we're able to take risks and push through blockages that private companies often just aren't. We are committed to removing these blockages and making it easier for other actors to enter these markets and succeed, thereby reducing the huge affordable housing deficits that all of these countries experience. And there are such big opportunities available. We estimate that globally, affordable housing is a $17 trillion untapped market. And we're proving that low-cost affordable homes are commercially viable propositions. But there are blockages, and in many ways, there is no bigger blockage from the lack of data. And without good data, we can't persuade the private sector of the opportunity here. We can't work with governments and other actors to identify the challenges and mitigate against them. We can't demonstrate that there is the potential for a strong formal market for those on lower incomes, and not just in high-end housing. However, though this is a core part of our mission, this wasn't why we originally got involved in this work. In 2019, Reall wanted to identify 4 or 5 key market-shaping indicators that would represent our impact on affordable housing markets. We wanted an easy way of measuring and demonstrating our successes. Unsurprisingly, this doesn't exist, and this is, of course, reflective of the wider data landscape. It became a case of, if we can't do that, what can we do? And this is really where our conversations with CAHF began. CAHF having very, very similar ambitions. This has really been a journey, and what we've ended up with is something far stronger and far more valuable than what Reall had originally planned. And my point here is about the power of working collaboratively by combining CAHF's think tank objectives and cross-continent connections, relationships, and reputation with Reall's practice-focused role as an affordable housing investor with a network of housing developers. We've been able to far more easily collect data from a far wider range of data holders, and hopefully create something that is more useful for the wider market too. So, in partnership with CAHF and 71.4, we've undertaken data collection across 8 countries, including Reall's priority countries of Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda, Mozambique and Ghana, where we are also active, and then Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, and Morocco. CAHF has since been able to add Rwanda to this list too. Data collection was followed by a process of analysis, review, rationalization, where we looked at each indicator and made an assessment of whether it was possible to collect, whether it was providing what we needed, and if there is a more suitable indicator that could replace it. And through this process, we streamlined an initial list of 135 indicators to 115, during which many were removed, added, or significantly revised. As demonstrated in the table here, our initial successes in populating indicators have varied significantly between countries, ranging from 65 in Kenya to 44 in Cote d'Ivoire in terms of the original 8 countries. Now, even 65 of 115 indicators doesn't sound particularly impressive, but this figure isn't really representative of the significant amount of work undertaken. As data collection was undertaken prior to a second review of indicators, what was collected in many cases doesn't match closely enough to a finalized list, which has seen indicators added, removed, and significantly changed. Many gaps will be easily populated in the future, as demonstrated by the separate work in Rwanda, where 96 were filled. But as also demonstrated in Rwanda, significant gaps do remain. overall, this is a work in progress, and this is the start of a long-term project rather than the completion. So later on, I'm going to show you our data dashboard, where you can access all the data collected so far, and talk a little bit about our work in taking this approach and extending it to Asia. At this point, though, I just want to thank you for listening to me, and I'm going to hand back to Kezia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. Ilana, Chris, you ready to share your screen and your story?
Brilliant. Thank you, Ilana. Ilana's going to drive, and then I'm going to talk through the beginning, and I'll hand over to her when her pod comes up. So yeah, thanks everyone. Today we're going to be talking a bit about the housing data landscapes work that we did in collaboration with CAHF and Reall over the last 2 years. As Ben showed earlier, you know, the indicators that we collected for those countries. I'm going to be talking a bit about, you know, where the data is in the data ecosystem. So who are the key custodians, and some key recommendations that we have identified going forward to improve visibility on the housing sector. Ilana is going to tell the interesting story about what can we actually see now that we have collected this data. What can it actually tell us? You know, which is the real point of all of this in the end, right? Thanks, Ilana. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so perhaps a good place to start would be to tell you what a data landscaping exercise actually entails. So we piloted the methodology that we developed with CAHF and Reall first in 8 countries in Africa, and it's since been kind of refined. As Ben said, we reduced the scope of indicators, refined the indicators that we are looking at, and it's been rolled out into Rwanda, India, and Pakistan as well. The main objective of the data landscape is really to identify who are the key collectors, generators, curators, and disseminators of housing data in each country. So we know who the key players are, basically. We also identify where it's often a regulator or a public sector entity, what legislation empowers them to collect data or store it, and how does that actually match up with what they are actually collecting and disseminating. And what this allows us to do is to really identify where our key blind spots are with regards to housing market activity and outcomes, and then through that develop strategies for unlocking, disseminating, disaggregating, or gathering new housing market data, where our overarching goal in the end is really to improve visibility on the sector. Thanks, Ilana. You can go next. So this is that slide. So what we have here are all the indicators that we developed. As Kezia said and Ben said, you know, we started off with the biggest set of indicators. We've refined it down, but this is really, these indicators form the core or the foundation of these data landscape reports. They span the value chain, so activity along the housing value chain. They also talk to critical contextual areas around housing, and within each they've been broken up within the value chain. You've got your different kind of categories, you know, indicators related to land and infrastructure, related to construction and investment, sales and rental, maintenance and management. And then within each of those value chain links, you've also got a couple of themes that the indicators speak to specifically. And what this kind of allows us to do is it ensures that we kind of covering the entire all housing market activity in a sense, you know. So the trade-off is, you know, you might by focusing on too few indicators, you could miss critical data sources. And we also want to make sure that the tail doesn't wag the dog, right? So we aren't collecting these indicators, the data for these indicators, just for the sole purpose of populating them. What the exercise of collecting the data really allows us to do is to identify the key data sets within a country for housing data and the key custodians of housing data. Because how the process usually works is, you know, you have an indicator that you want to go find. You have to trawl through sometimes reports, sometimes it's a very iterative process of collecting this data. And through that process, you uncover lots of golden nuggets that you weren't necessarily looking for to begin with, but that you've uncovered because you were looking for this data. And how we've also been working with this is that we try to populate the indicators and collect data along a variety of dimensions. So we've got indicators that speak to the national level. For instance, you know, how much was invested in residential housing in a country. Then we've got ones that focus on urban specifically. So, you know, what is the proportion of population living in slums in urban areas? Maybe just focusing on the main urban centers. So for instance, in Nairobi, in Kenya, what is the price of the cheapest house and how big is it? And then you've also got indicators that focus on the bottom 40. So what does housing conditions look like for people that are in the poorest 40% of the urban population? In other instances, you also collect data from developers directly when you can't get representative data at a city or national or urban level. What we have kind of found is that the richest data landscape is really in the public sector. And this is administrative data and transactional data, which was collected not necessarily with the original purpose of providing market intelligence, but it can provide a lot of market intelligence. And I think Data Agenda seeks to start this conversation and let the custodians know how much value their data actually has for market participants. Ilana, you can go to the next slide. So what we've kind of done in the data landscape exercises is, you know, you can kind of group the key curators or, you know, key data custodians for housing data into these three broad groups, kind of generalized across all the different countries to get a more, you know, aggregated message across. But you've got your regulator and your government departments. You've got your private institutions or industry bodies, and then you've got your NGOs and your DFIs and your other multinational organizations. And the high value data is really sitting in the regulator and government departments. This is data that is going to be representative either at a city level or at a national level or within a province or a state, you know, an administrative unit. You aren't going to, you know, whereas when you go to private institutions, you often struggle with extrapolating data points to a wider representation. So for instance, it's only you're getting project level data from a single developer. You don't know how this translates to the whole market. Is this applicable to a lower income household that might want to buy a house, or is this developer targeting the upper income bracket? And what we found is that these regulators and government departments, they have amazing systems that are set up to collect this data. It's just not really being disseminated into the public domain. Your NGOs and your DFIs also produce very valuable, often, you know, contextual data. So we get a lot of the contextual indicators will come from sources like the World Bank, the IMF, the International Labour Organization, or the UN. And there's also you get some surveys that are funded by NGOs, like the Fin Access survey in Kenya. Very valuable, often done in collaboration with the National Statistics Bureau. But really the core of high value data is sitting in the public sector. And there, you know, we would really be looking at the key gaps that we've kind of identified have been with regards to the earlier links in the value chain, you know, the land and infrastructure, house construction, and then also market performance data with regards to sales and transfers and property transactions. You can go to the next slide, Ilana. So what we have here is we've taken the kind of across the 11 countries that we've done data audits for, we've taken the kind of core, I would say, next steps that we would identify from an engagement perspective. And we've broken it up into these sort of 4 categories, you know, unlocking data, disseminating existing data, disaggregating existing data so that it speaks to a housing specific interest, and then gathering data where nothing exists. And so that's like the 4 rows that you see. Then the columns are the kind of either the data producers or the data sets that are really of high value that are not being used, you know, to its full potential. And I would say, you know, you can see there, what I've done is I've highlighted in bold the kind of the high value or items. And in land administration, we often struggle to find data. Just how many title deeds are there in a country? How many transactions were there in the last year of residential transfers? Sometimes you might find this data in the middle of an economic survey report that is 300 pages long, and on the second last page, there's one row in a table that speaks to this data point. In other times, you have, in the case of Rwanda, there is a dashboard that tracks on a live basis the residential transactions and transfers and the number of title deeds that have been registered and are being registered. So you can see that there is, you know, that is kind of like the gold standard, I would say, in a sense. Then we also struggle a lot on building permit, and so the building procedures, timelines, and housing starts, housing completions, those kind of core indicators. A lot of countries have e-permitting systems where the whole procedure of applying for a building permit, you know, getting it approved, getting an occupancy permit in the end, that's all done online electronically. And those systems are actually developed to produce reports that summarize, you know, what has been done, how many permit applications did we have, in which areas even. But we haven't really found anyone releasing statistics on this. So there's, you know, it's a kind of a quick win that would be very high value in the market, just to see how many starts and finishes were there. Another great custodian of data, which is usually the Department of Public Works and Housing, or the government ministry that's in charge of building infrastructure and building housing. And here you can really fill key gaps related to costs of construction, volumes and timeframes as well. So, you know, we often struggle with figuring out what is residential building cost inflation over a year. There's some companies that provide reports on an annual basis, but not always for all the countries. And the Ministry of Public Works and Housing would be a great area to release that kind of data. And then lastly, I just want to talk about the central bank and the Statistics Bureau. At the central bank, you know, we've seen some that release really quite detailed financial stability reports, for instance, that really focus in on the residential mortgage sector, but that's not always the case. You know, we often struggle to find then, you know, data on volume of mortgages, value of mortgages, and also financing terms. It's very difficult to talk about affordability if you don't have good data on what the terms are of the financial arrangements that people make for their mortgages. Linked to this is data on incomes. That's always a tricky one to fill, and it's a key, as Ilana will talk about in her next session, it's a key input into any calculation around affordability, along with the financing terms for the finance product. We often rely on household survey data where the households report either via like a recall method, or they have a diary that records the expenditure and the income. But we found when we compare different sources of income data, of survey income data, the incomes vary quite significantly across the sources. So a great alternative for this would be to use the Revenue Authority's income data and to produce kind of aggregated level of income. But I'm going to hand over at this point to Ilana. She's going to talk a bit more about the actual data that we did manage to collect, and especially with regards to the themes of affordability and informality. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I hope you can all hear me. I do have a little bit of an unstable internet connection, so I'm going to go through things as quickly as possible in the hope that I reduce exposure to risk of being shut out by whichever service provider is providing internet. On the demand side, the story we wanted to just take you through was how we think about affordability. And I mean, obviously it's critical. We're all interested in affordable housing, but no one can really tell us what affordable housing is. What we know about housing is that it's unaffordable. And the question about affordability is, who do we want it to be affordable to? And this question is not a simple one to answer. So let me just take you through some of the data that we've collected in the context of this question of affordability from the demand side. I'm going to start with data from Kenya and just look at the traditional way that we assess affordability, starting with the house. How much is a house? And of course, which house are we talking about? And we've got an indicator, the cost of the cheapest developer-built housing unit, and in Kenya, the data that we could find on that was 4 million shillings, and you can see our assessment, and we've got a quality assessment for every indicator, is that it's not so good. And why is it not so good? Because we spoke to a couple of developers. So there's no systematic collection of data and publication of data on newly developed housing stock and what prices they're coming in at. So I think that's the first part we start with, the question of finance. How do we finance it? There's the mortgage product again. How good is that data? Well, we phoned a couple of banks. So no systematic collection of data on the terms and interest rates associated with mortgage products. And we all know, those of us who applied for mortgages recently, it depends on who is applying the interest rate that you get. Monthly installments, that's a calculation, so that we're quite comfortable with. The percentage of income allocated to repayments. And I know this is a hot topic, lots and lots of interest in this area. The standard metric is 30%. I think, if I stand to be corrected, I think that 30% comes from the New Deal back in the 1930s, I think, or 1940s. No one really knows where 30% comes from. And certainly what we'll show you is that in the context of affordable markets, whatever those are, where income is really constrained, 30% is probably way too high. Minimum income that makes the installment affordable is a calculation, and there we go. What is the percentage of households that earn at least this amount to be able to be called in the market for addressable market for affordable housing? You can see our source of data there is CGID, and I hope there's no one from CGID on this call. And we give that, unfortunately, not a very good quality assessment, and we'll talk to that a little bit later. Just to start off with the household, we started with a house in the previous version. If we start with the household, that's quite interesting, because I think the one thing about demand and characterizing demand is that you can never really characterize it. I mean, what do people want? What do people need? I don't even know what I want and I need. I mean, how are we supposed to get a sense of this for an entire market? I think the main thing on the demand side is to try and imagine this person or this household. What do they look like? Is it a single person, a one-person household? A newly urbanized young man who's come to a city to find work? Is that the household we've got in mind? Or is it a nuclear family, two parents, mom and dad and kids? What is this household? And I think that's the first question to start with. Who are we talking about? There's diversity in the market. It's really critical also to remember that the household itself, the formation of a household, is a response. It's a response to so many things, including the availability of housing. So we start with the assumption that a household is exogenous. We take it as a given, and then we say, well, what is demand? And I think it's really important that we don't do that. And we just remember that housing and households create each other, and certainly in the case of the rental market, that's absolutely true. It's not only offtake for housing that households are there for, but also supply. And you can see that in the data on rental, and this is a critical indicator because rental markets are, as you can see, significant in a number of countries. And this is data that comes from household surveys, and the quality assessment often just depends on how recent that survey data is. You'll see in a number of countries there is no data, even on the percentage of households that rent. And increasingly, as we know, the rental market becomes a critical focus for us to look at. In many cases, the surveys might have just, do you own your dwelling, as opposed to what's the tenure for. Just want to talk to a little bit this question of supply and demand wrapped up in the rental market. And this is data out of Rwanda. And we've been fortunate to take a very extensive look at the Rwanda data with CAHF and with AFR in Rwanda. And just to look at the profile of households in urban areas that rent, and it's approximately 50% of households in urban areas in Rwanda who are renting, and the households that are providing that rental accommodation, because it's principally provided by households. And you can see again the difference in household composition. And I want to just point out that one-person household, again, is a critical segment of the market. And to ask the question, how bankable is rental income? Because when you have supply and demand wrapped up, it's critical that the financial sector responds to that. And the question about rental income is, can the financial sector actually see it? Can it bank it? So really important to think about that. Bankable income. Okay, so we've got the CGID data, and this is data, household income data. It's out of the CAHF yearbook. So I'm sure those of you who are familiar with the yearbook will be familiar with these charts. And it's basically just looking at purchasing power parity, dollar-related incomes, low to high, and we're looking at rural versus urban, and unsurprisingly, we'll see a skew in terms of higher income households in urban areas, and that's across all countries. But just to point out about CGID, and of course we don't like casting aspersions on other people's data, but sometimes we must. So this is just the sort of description of the data that CGID actually provides. Lots of data sources that they're using and massively complex algorithms that should inspire confidence when we've got a description like that, massively complex. Just other points down at the bottom here, which really, again, it's a very difficult task. We know that, and we are the only people in the world who can do this correctly, and our methods are proprietary. So that's very comforting. So they're the only people who can do this, and they're not going to tell you how they do it. Just trust them. They're CGID. So again, household income, very, very difficult to get a good handle on. And what is the income and what is bankable income? That's the question for us. How much of that income would be visible to a financial institution who would want to responsibly provide housing finance? And there, the digital revolution, we're excited to say, does offer some really exciting opportunities to create bankable income. I want to rush through this quickly again, just looking at this question of the 30%. We're not comfortable with the 30% in all honesty. If you just look at the expenditure on food, and this is in urban areas, the blue is expenditure on food, and you can see what renter households are paying and what all households are paying in urban areas on food, or percentage of expenditure on food, and then the housing related expenditure. And possibly we should include in that also transport, because housing and transport are two sides of the same coin. We can possibly create affordable housing if we put it in the middle of nowhere, because then the land costs are very low. But the transport costs will be very high. So you've got to really look at the affordability in a more holistic sense. The other point about expenditure data, of course, is that it doesn't include savings because it's expenditure. And so we're not looking at whether households are saving for housing and what the nature of that housing savings might take. And of course, an opportunity for the financial sector to facilitate that too. I'm not going to look at this data in particular. This is data of the cheapest house built by developers. Again, these are the indicators. You can see the indicator rating that we give it, not terribly high. And this is because, again, we've spoken to some developers. There's no systematic collection of this data. So it's not a very good quality assessment, but just to look at the variability of the data that is coming back, and this is in today's US dollars. So this is not purchasing power parity adjusted. This is today's exchange rate, just to see how that varies across the countries that we looked at. You can get data on housing sort of resale. That's also a critical supply into the market. I say you can, theoretically you can, but in practice you can't. This is just data we scraped off some property listing sites in Rwanda. We did a similar exercise in Tanzania on the rental market a couple of years ago. So you scrape data at your own risk. And of course, we don't know what the price actually transacted for in the market and whether the property actually sold. And of course, we've got very few properties in some cases that we're looking at this data for. But just to get a sense of that resale market, and we're forced to do this because the data, as Chris mentioned, is just not made available. The housing stock, again, the question of mortgageability. If the mortgage is going to be the principal financing instrument, how much of that stock is mortgageable? Well, it's one thing to look at how many households own their properties to get a sense of what kind of housing stock there might be. But the question is, how many of them have got a title deed? How many of them can be legally repossessed? And it's terrible to think about repossession when we're talking about mortgages, but just like we have an antenuptial agreement when we get married, that's what provides the basis for the financier to come into the agreement. And from a legal perspective, it wouldn't be possible to repossess that property unless it's registered in the deeds office. And I stand to be corrected. That's certainly the case in South Africa, but perhaps in other countries it might be different, and it would be very interesting to hear if that's the case. But just the data on the number of properties with a title deed that we could collect, you can see the quality rating we give it, very poor, in many cases just not published by the right regulator. We would want to see it published by the right institution. So you're getting some numbers occasionally in some places, and often we don't know. This number from Morocco, I would put a red line through it. It's definitely wrong. This is a case of things being lost in translation. It's a French publication translated. We don't know if this is new titles registered in that particular year, but for a country like Morocco, this is definitely incorrect data. And then, of course, the mortgage finance options themselves to create affordability. And here again, just looking at that data that we found and the gaps that we've got, the number of mortgages issued per annum, that's a critical indicator. And unbelievably, we could not find it in any of the countries we were looking at. It's a critical data point. How many mortgages are issued? Number of mortgages outstanding. Also, you can see gaps in many countries, but in some countries that data was available. And what you can see, just comparing the number of households who say they own with the number of households who have a mortgage. We'd love to do that in the comparison with title deeds and mortgages, but in many cases we can't do it. I would say Tanzania is probably one of the cases where we looks like we can do that, and you can see extensive opportunities for growth in the mortgage market. Casey, I'm not sure that we have time actually to look at the informality and the supply side, so perhaps you can advise me on that.
You know, I think you actually do. I think you've got about 5 minutes, 7
Okay.
minutes. Yeah. Go
Awesome.
ahead.
Right. Great. So I'll do this very quickly. On the supply side, the indicators that we've got, the nice thing about supplies, you should be able to know what your supply is, and that's because we're tracking formal supply. But the point about housing markets in so many African countries is that the market is not full, and that the real activity is not happening in the formal market. So it's really a question of saying, you know, this is the streetlight effect on steroids. We've got the data, we can see it in some cases, and so we report it as the market. But in fact, this is not the market. How do we understand informal housing? What is informality? You know, a lot of the stuff that we take on informality comes out of economic activities. It comes out of the labor market and small business activity. In housing, we can't use it just informal to talk about materials used for walls and roofs. So you've got data coming out of surveys on that. Our quality rating depends on when the last year of survey data we can actually access. So in many cases, it's quite old. But you can see in some countries we've got really good survey data. And by the way, we've put this on a dashboard with CAHF, so that's available online. We can also look at services, access to water, access to sanitation. That's also out of survey data, and you can see quality of that data is sometimes very good. This is from the World Bank APR, so we rate it highly. I don't know if we should, but comes out of a lot of surveys that are done periodically, so you can get that data to there, and you can see access to sanitation, population without access to sanitation and without access to water, and you're seeing some really interesting challenges there. So do we have a housing problem, or do we have a sanitation problem? And I think that's a really interesting question to tease out. We can look at a couple of other combinations of things relating to the house itself, the dwelling itself. You know, we've looked at the materials used for the walls. We've looked at whether the utilities, obviously the extent of overcrowding in a property as well. We can get that from the data, and so we might want to characterize housing instead of calling it informal. We might want to say it's in need of some investment. There's visible need for investment, and you can see across the countries that we looked at extensive need for investment in housing. Another way to look at formality is to look at this question of administrative visibility, and this is something increasingly of interest to us. And you know, the nice thing about houses is that you can see them even if they are informal, whatever that means. And if you can see it, usually you can count it, and that creates enumerability, which then possibly creates administrative visibility. And this is just a picture of an informal settlement in Cape Town, and it's data that's generated by the City of Cape Town itself. And so the City of Cape Town, using imagery, doing the roof mapping to kind of identify the housing units, that creates formality just by definition. We have this in an administrative system. Unfortunately, it's on a spreadsheet. It's not integrated with the rest of the city's data, but it does potentially create administrative visibility. The question of effective administration is another question. And here the indicator that we would look at is how many properties are rated for taxation purposes, excuse me. And you can see again, lots of gaps there. We've got some data from Kenya and Ghana. We don't rate the quality of that data very highly. Another way of looking at it is looking at applications, so permitting applications, in this case for improvements. And again, we don't have a lot of data, and the data that we have, we don't rate very highly. So the question of administrative governance also critical. Formality is also critical for the banks, for the banking sector, and bankability and lenders rather than banks. But bankability, again, critical, and these indicators relating to the title deeds, which we've spoken about before, the residential resale transactions. How many residential resale transactions occur per annum? One would think we would know that because those are registered and formal, but in fact, we didn't find that data for any country. Not one country that we looked at, and likewise lots of data gaps on the dwellings completed annually. So I'll leave it there, Casey, with lots of questions about what we mean on supply and formality, and I hope that's piqued your interest in having a look at the data. But I think really the key point to leave everyone with is that this is just the start. The indicators that we've got are just the start, and really we hope that they pique interest rather than give you a sense of we know everything and we've got a number so we can move on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ilana. I mean, I think what comes out so strongly in this is indicators indicate, and they indicate almost a universe of the things that we can then go and do next. Very interested in the data quality assessments. I have to say that when I first saw that low score on the cheapest newly built house indicator, I was a bit offended because that's our indicator. But I take the point, and we're doing the best we can, and that's why we have this data agenda to improve the quality. I'd like to now call on Maria and Claudio. I'd love to hear what you think. So much of what we've done, all of us, it comes from what you started, actually, both of you in your different domains, and you've worked so much in championing data, Maria, through Hofinet, but even more broadly than that, and also I remember the early days of the Housing Indicators Program at the World Bank. And Claudio, your work at UN Habitat in championing the Housing Indicators Program there. So I'm very, very glad to have you both here to speak with us and share with us your thoughts. Yeah, over to you, Maria. Let me open to you first. Maria, you're on mute.
Thank you all for this wonderful effort. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you also for inviting me earlier on. I'm just now not looking at this for the first time, as you can imagine. I have been in the good, fortunate position to have been able to comment and work with the team on the data. So I know it quite intimately, and I'm very impressed with the effort, and also impressed with the core message that data is available, but that we have to do a better job getting at it, coordinating it and disseminating it. And that message, I think, is a very, very powerful one. Also, the fact that this data is there in the public domain, which is very important for us to understand, because when it is in the public sector, it is in the public domain. The public sector makes it available and we can utilize it. So there is no issue of private information and so on. We can utilize it because the public sector has put it in the public domain, which is different from the private sector data. That requires a lot more effort. And I'm coming back to that particular point and how a country like the United States has solved that problem. For that, the US, with all its faults, has done something exceedingly right, and that is data collection on the housing sector. So we should learn from that. So congratulations to the team. I'm very, very impressed, and I think this is really the core of a more global exercise. You're already taking it more international, beyond the region of sub-Saharan Africa. And you will see when you take it to other continents that many of the indicators will have to be adjusted in order to make them globally relevant. And that will mean that you sanitize your data. So your 115, 117, whatever it's going to be, indicators will change. And we have done that with HOFINET, which was started as global. So immediately from the start, in order to get housing finance information from across the world, I had to make sure that all the definitions were globally applicable. And that is a very good lesson, you know, what one country considers a fixed rate mortgage, and other country says, oh, no, it's not at all. This is not fixed rate, this is adjustable. Take the balloon mortgage in Canada, big disputes. So you will find that on all these scores, when you go global, you will make adjustments. So it is always a work in progress, but a very, very important one. I want to put a little bit of perspective because I am so old that I have indeed participated in so many of the efforts to create housing indicators. So we started indeed with the World Bank housing indicators in the 90s. That was a very interesting exercise where we all learned how to precisely define housing indicators and on a global scale, and how to not make it too complicated, because countries could simply not collect a lot of information. You have 117 indicators. Those are indicators, they are not variables. If you count the variables, you have a mass more. Impossible. So we were told not more than 24 indicators, driven by several variables, but not too many. So we learned a lot in that exercise. We went global. I was responsible for, during that exercise in the World Bank, for sub-Saharan Africa. So from 1990, I was very much aware of where the data was, what was not there, how difficult it was to collect. The lessons from that exercise and the ones that followed, driven by, on Latin America, driven by the Inter-American Bank, which was city indicators, city housing indicators. We understood from the city housing indicators that that is not a very useful concept, because housing data in many areas are national, not city. Take the whole housing finance sector. So that effort had so much stress related to the differentiation between city and national. You need both. You can't have city only, but you need cities in order to get the permits, the housing starts, God knows what. But you need national for income. You need national for mortgage sector data, as Ilana just mentioned. So that was another difficulty and a very important lesson that we learned. Then we started HOFINET in the 2000s, in 2010, and we had big lessons from that as well. And we had champions in each country, in 60 countries, that drove the data collection, but we didn't have a real coordination at the national level, and I come back to that. So we have many important lessons of the importance of and how much the industry wants standardized, comparable data that is comparable across countries, not just within a country, but that can be utilized to compare what countries. I'm working in so many countries. They always ask me, how are other countries doing? And if I can't compare my indicators on the housing sector across countries, I really cannot have a meaningful policy conversation to say, this is what is done in other countries, and this is how it is doing. So critically important for both the private investors as well as government policymakers to have this global, comparable, standardized data collection effort, which is so hard to create, but exceedingly important. And what we also understood from all these different efforts is that you need at the national level local champions that will help you coordinate that data and disseminate the data. But that's insufficient. If you want a global exercise or a multinational exercise, you need a multinational entity backing this effort. And if that is not there, NGOs are powerful. CAHF plays an incredible role. Reall plays an incredible role. 71, incredible role. But you are not eternity. You are not, there needs to be a backing by the multinational community for this data to go on, be standardized, be disseminated in a timely manner and over the longer term. So we have learned all those lessons from all these previous efforts that we have done. You have, when you look at the Kenya data that you send us, and everyone in, I think, has that Kenya example, you have a critical slide, and I can't remember, I think it is slide 93. I'm having it right in front of me. Look, all of you participants, to slide 93. And it summarizes beautifully the whole conversation that we have had so far with the team of data collectors and cleaners and disseminators. It shows how many critical institutions at a national level are involved in data collection. When you look at that slide, immediately as a data collector, you, for one sector, you will know that all these different silos where the data are housed, the Office of Statistics, the central banks, all the different other public entities, not to speak of all the private sector entities, the realtors, the builders, and so on, the mortgage bankers, that all that data is collected somewhere, and it does exist, but it needs to be coordinated at a national level. So if there is no leadership at the national level, it remains nearly impossible for individual consultants supported by NGOs or by other entities to collect that data in a way that is manageable and cheap. You need to have, you can't keep, paying consultants every year to compile that information. It won't work. You need at the national level some entity that does that for you. So, and that is where I come to the United States example. In the 70s, the United States decided that the housing sector was too critical for economic development of the country to leave it on its own, to have all these different actors collect information, do what they needed. And they started from the leadership of the Ministry of Housing, our HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, to talk to all the actors in this field, public and private, and that's critical. They were conveying the message that for everyone, the investors as well as the government policymakers, it was critical for their efforts to come together and collect data, each in their own field, and that HUD, if they trusted HUD with that task, would compile all the data on a regular schedule and put that data out. Not all data, but the critical data. Then each entity could develop indicators on a much more detailed level the realtors, the home builders, the mortgage sector, they collected data in much greater detail, which they also put out in the public domain, but they shared on an absolute regular timescale the data, the core data with HUD, with the ministry. And at that time also, the decision was made that the Office of Statistics would have to play a critical role with standardized information and a housing survey that was done every 2 years. All that information then, and the timeline at which that information became available, and I forget one important actor here, and that is local governments. All local governments, thousands, were asked to provide their information to HUD on the permitting, housing starts, etc. That information then was looked at, disseminated, cleaned, put in a nice format, and made available to the public by HUD. Still is going on. And as a result, the housing sector is much more developed by way of research, comparable data, incomparable. The United States, nearly all housing studies, as you can look at major housing studies, originate in the United States. And that is simply because of our data effort. So that example is worthwhile looking at. And that brings me to my conclusion, obviously, is that indeed we need strong champions at the national level that have the trust to work with both the public sector entities, from the central bank to the Office of Statistics and everything in between, and the private sector. The private institutions like the Home Builders Association, the Realtors Association, the Mortgage Bankers Association have to begin in most countries for their own benefit to collect data on their sectors. They will understand, and we have to help them to understand this, that it is so beneficial for the growth of their individual industries to have good data and to share that data. Once you get that understanding, now you can have the champion being very effective in the coordination and dissemination of the information. So you need high-level commitment at the national level, which you really can only get when the high level, the top, understand how critical this sector is for the economy of a country. And I can't emphasize that. And many of you already know that we have just for Habitat for Humanity made a study trying to get really solid data on the size of the housing sector for the economy in emerging markets. We know all that in developed countries, developed advanced economies, but not in emerging economies. And so we found in the 11 countries for which we did detailed research that indeed the housing sector is between 13 to 16, even 20 in Brazil, % of GDP. Now, when you talk about a sector of that magnitude, the policymakers in the country have no choice than to pay attention to this sector. And so you need to whet their appetite and show how important it is so they can provide the leadership at the national level to coordinate public and private sector data collection and begin to have a national effort that makes sense. Then for the time being, the important NGOs like CAHF can compile that information in a way that it is not costing a fortune to do so. and it can do so on a yearly basis. Ultimately, that effort has to go, of course, to more permanent multilateral agencies. That is the path forward. So I'm looking at where this might go and the path forward for this critical exercise. I'm very excited, but I know this is the critical first step, and that we need to understand how to move forward. So that is all I want to say about it. But I'm very grateful for what you have done and the detail that you have done it in, the definitions, the institutional component. Where is this data normally located? And very, very important work. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Maria. I really, really appreciate that. As you were speaking, a comment came through from Robert Hornsby from Jobomax, and he was saying that Shelter Afrique is composed of has 44 governments as its shareholders, and maybe they would play a pretty strong role, could play a pretty strong role in advocating this message. And what's quite nice about that too is that the MD of Shelter Afrique is also the chairman of the African Union for Housing Finance. So we're all friends, and this is a small family. And I think that message that you're bringing forward is certainly very powerful. Thank you. Claudio, can I turn over to you and hear from you what you think? What are your reflections? There was an interesting comment that also came through from someone saying, I think the point she was making was the difference between the nuance of a socio-political context and then the facts of the matter as they appear in data, and how one manages those together. You have a list of indicators. I guess partly what Chris was saying earlier, we don't want the tail to wag the dog, that the numbers that we're collecting, very interesting, but you need to think about them in terms of place and context as well. But I'll leave it to you, Claudia. You're on mute, Claudio. Oh, good.
Well, after Maria's intervention, it's quite difficult for me not to be redundant and repeat some of the things she already said. Let me start with the congratulations to the work done, because that deserves over and over, because it's an effort. And I've been following from a distance. When I noticed that Maria had received the document and she was so accurate in her comments to Kessia, I said, I'm not going to pre-read anything, and I'm going to react on what I hear and what I think makes sense from the presentations. So I'm speaking from what I hear from you today, and not from what I had the chance to look at. Now, without repeating, but I think it's worth to repeat, how did I come across the issue of data and CAHF, and how important in the context of Africa, and in particular, the issue of information about the housing sector was so relevant? I was starting with the housing profiles. So I was leading the whole housing work of UN Habitat from 2008 onwards. And it was obvious that there was an asymmetry of information in all the markets I was observing. Some people knew some information, others had no idea. So prices could go any direction depending with whom you spoke, with whom you negotiated, because there was no transparency and there was no information available that could be considered as reliable. So a methodology for housing profile was an approach to collect information in a number of sources, organized in a systematic way by looking at supply of land, supply of infrastructure, prices of this, price of that, the institutional framework in housing finance. And then that's when CAHF came on board and said, wow, yeah, there is an institution that is actually systematically looking at how the housing finance industry works, and that's how we came across. And then I come to the issue of information. Yeah, there are a lot of information there, It's not systematically collected. It's not systematically analyzed and put available. So the first effort is really to make sure that we have a process, both institutionally and methodologically speaking, that can bring regularity of the collection, analysis, and dissemination. That costs money and costs time. So how do we put the things together? Let me start with some, let's say, strong recommendation that aligns with Maria. When you speak about the number of indicators, when we enter into this field, we seem to be so fascinated that the numbers keep increasing because everything seems to be relevant and important and allow us to read more. Now, when I arrived in UN Habitat, there was a discussion among the UN agencies to measure the human rights components of all the covenants. And I was responsible as coordinator of the UN Housing Rights Program, how to measure the realization of housing rights in countries. And the Office of High Commission on Human Rights had an enormous amount of indicators, and we were trying to convince them that we had no resources, no money, no institutional framework to collect all that number of information that was necessary to validate the indicators. So I think one important recommendation that I will give, let's try to narrow down the number of indicators so that they can be more systematically produced and the information is not so costly, and that a standardization can be made in order that you can repeat the exercise with more regularity, because the regularity will bring the reliability, and the reliability will give you the power and the interest for support that is important for some purpose, and I'll come to that. We all know, and Maria just told us how important the housing sector is, and my connection with the European Housing Partnership proved that over and over recently, where we have more than 200 institutions in Europe in a framework of a housing partnership, and one of the things is driven by data, because there is an incredible systematic work done with the country members to collect data on housing, because it is important for the economy, it's important for the market, it's important for the prosperity, and it's important for a number of other actors that trigger. Information means good indicators, means good decisions, or well-informed or evidence-based decisions, which have tremendous impact in people's life and in the economy and business. But there is another one that I did not see in your presentation. It's about the human rights component. We're talking about a recognized international right, which is the right of adequate housing, that has 7 clear criteria of, let's say, adequacy, defining there are some indicators. So let's not reinvent the wheel or try to do something different. And Ilana already spoke about the informal and the formal housing. And what UN Habitat is doing at the moment, I'm following now as an outsider because I retire last 31st of December 2019, but I'm still assisting colleagues. Now they're measuring the housing inadequacy by bringing back the indicators of slums, the operational indicators or definition of slums, with the 5 components that Ilana mentioned, except the security of tenure, but all the others she mentioned, because this has influenced a lot of census around the world, because countries were compelled to report for the MDGs, and therefore they had to adapt their census in order to be able to report, because otherwise they would be in bad, let's say publicly, in a bad position in front of the international community. So there was an effort. So, and if you look at the definition, it's a human rights-based definition of slums that allow us to talk about housing inadequacy, which affects dramatically not only the quality of life, but also markets and well, name it. The impact of informality. This is a work I've been doing quite a lot in Latin America in recent years. So I think this could give you the dimension of human progress, giving a human face to the indicators that will allow you to negotiate higher with multilateral organizations that have the obligation to support the realization of this human right, which is the right to adequate housing. How many countries already have, more than 100 already put in their constitution, the obligation of the state to realize the conditions in the housing sector that people can access adequate housing. So it's not that the state will have to provide little houses and apartments for every citizen. No, is that creates the conditions in the housing sector to perform and allow people to access housing. And I think that's an important component that is a bit hidden in the effort you're doing about the indicators that will connect you with some important global policy comparison that are going on, because countries have the obligation for the next 10 years to report on the SDG 11.1. That is what? Access to affordable housing, slum upgrading, and public and basic services. So the whole issue of preventing slums to happen by providing housing alternatives, and the other improving slums where it's possible, so you produce housing without building new houses. Actually, that's what you're doing. But you put infrastructure, you regularize land, so there is a transformation in adequacy of housing that is there. And I think this is Maria spoke about that. I think the power of CAHF and its partners, and I think the more partners together, instead of doing all separate, joining together, I'm very happy to see that. This is the future, partnership, getting the best of everyone, and producing the case and making the case, because the next step in this generation will be to really bring, and I can put myself available to support this action as well, to bring the big players to that, the big players that are supporting. And one of the fundamental questions is that we could make: why is it that the African Development Bank does not enter into this area? And why is it so many banks don't enter? Is it because it's bad business? Is it because it's unreliable? Is it because I don't have information? And I hear you have the golden pot in your hand. This is how you bring these banks to realize that also Africans have the right to have a loan that is affordable to them if they don't have the cash, or they have the alternatives in the market to buy what they are able to buy, or to rent because they don't want to buy, or they cannot buy, or they want to live here, and to live here is expensive, so I cannot buy, I can only rent. But that's a decision. So that's the objective of policy, is to give people the freedom to choose, and indicators are fundamental, data are fundamental to have that. In the Dutch, where I am at the moment in Rotterdam, so one of the things that some years back is, what was the objective of the housing policy? Give the freedom to choose. And how did they do that? Good, reliable information, no asymmetry. The moment I'm buying a house and I'm doing a negotiation with the seller in the notary's office, it's alive. Anyone can follow. You can go there on the website. This is the secret of the US. In the market, where indicators, information, including the tax you pay on your house, is public. You can go there and look. And I think That's the way we have to go with the countries in Africa that we're working, but also other regions in the developing world. Sorry about this passionate about the housing rights, but I think you connect so well with the effort that I feel really, I'm very happy to see the work you've done. It's really, really nice. I'm so happy to see that. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That's really nice to hear. While you were speaking, I quickly put into the chat a URL for a dashboard that we launched today. In fact, it's part of this overall data agenda for Africa that starts to speak to some of the issues you raised, because I'm also blown away that the question of households living in slums does not equate to the number of houses you have to build. There's a whole lot of other interventions that can happen in between. I really want to give everybody the chance to see the data though. And so Ben, can I hand over to you quickly? I think we're going to go a bit over, and if you'll all indulge us, Ben has some wonderful things to show you. So can I hand over to you, Ben?
Brilliant, thank you.
Great,
and
okay.
Thank you very much to Maria, Claudio, Ilana, and Chris for really interesting presentations. So Reall launched its data dashboard last year with an aim of making data on Reall funded projects publicly available. We now have over 100 projects available on this dashboard and data on houses built, project finances, client demographics, and income. But we're really committed to making the MSI data available and accessible to all. And we've now expanded our dashboard to include the data we've been discussing today. So I wanted to just quickly demonstrate how that works now, recognizing we are a bit short on time, so I will go through it as quickly as I can. So I hope you can now see our dashboard. What we have here is a navigable map, which is the best way of viewing all the data, and some information in terms of global impact. So if you click on a country, you first of all get some information in terms of Reall's work. And then you can either click through to Reall project data or market shaping indicators data. So I'll do that now. For each country, we have this overview narrative, which is really based on the excellent country narratives that CAHF put together in their annual yearbooks. We then highlighted 8 key indicators, which we see as some of the most important indicators. For each of these, you can click on see all MSI countries, and you can get the view across all the countries we've covered so far. If I go further down, this is where we have the actual bulk of the indicators, and we split them up into these 7 key categories, which you can navigate through the tabs here. For each of these, we have further narrative about that section, and then all the indicator data here. As I think we've discussed throughout these presentations, there are gaps in this data, and we've been very, very open and honest about those. We display all indicators, whether it's filled or not, because that is an important part of the data story in each country. Obviously, we'll be going back each year, trying to fill those gaps, trying to improve and build out the data further. But for now, there are quite a few gaps. For each of these sections, you can switch between local currency and US dollars. You can also search for specific indicators. So you can, for example, type in mortgage, and that'll take you to that indicator. So we show the quality scores, which Ilana was talking about earlier, but you can also go into those in more detail by clicking on the left-hand arrow here. That then gives you scores for each section in which quality was defined. You can also then look at the various elements which make up each indicator. And we also link to the sources for each of those too, so you can then go into more detail on each of those. We also have a document section. We'll be adding to this over the next few days based on the various excellent documents that have been created from this project. And then right at the top here, we have a download data button. Through this, just give it a second to come through. You can select countries. You can turn various columns on and off. Once it's there, we are. And then by clicking on here, simply providing name, company, reason for interest, and email address, you can register and download any of this data. And we really encourage you to do this. We really want people to be using this data, finding new things, sharing it more widely, and really kind of building on the work that's been done so far. This is really important. Finally, and very quickly, I just wanted to quickly demonstrate how this links up with the Reall projects data that we show here. So by clicking on View Reall Projects, it takes you to our projects country page, where you do get that overview of work that we've done in each country. And again, it's client data, project finances. You can then use the map here to really navigate the various projects that we've done. I'll click on this one here. So this takes us to the Semper Motto project, which is implemented with our partner Nachu. You can see the project using the satellite image here. You can understand who that project was serving, view how many houses are built, what kind of facilities are nearby, the kinds of clients who are living on the project, and then information on the types of houses built and the project finances. Finally, again, we have a document section. We have documents talking about the impact of various projects in the countries we work in. We have client case studies on various of these projects too, really kind of giving a broader idea of who we're serving, what kind of impact this work has done. And we know that affordable housing has had such a huge impact on these people's lives, these people who are living on the projects we funded here. So I'm going to stop there for the dashboard. I would really like to encourage all of you to take a look, to use the data, to go into it in more detail. We are also continuing to build on this, both in terms of what we show on the dashboard and in terms of the data overall with CAHF 71.4. We would love your feedback on what's here right now. We'd love to know what works well, what's missing, what we can do better in the future. So really keen to hear all about that. So I very quickly just want to touch on next steps, particularly in terms of what we are doing in Asia. So Reall is currently active in four countries in Asia, in India, Pakistan, Nepal, and the Philippines. And India and Pakistan are two of our priority countries. These countries, though, of course, very different in many ways, suffer from a lack of information and data on affordable housing, just like Africa. And like Africa, this is particularly an issue at the lower end of the market. Early on, we decided it was important to take this process from Africa and roll out in Asia too, starting with India and Pakistan. And I'm not going to talk in detail about the data landscapes there. That's not the point of the session, but I want to just touch on a couple of points. In Asia, we started with a finalized set of indicators and strong ideas from Africa on where data is likely to be sourced from. Some of the assumptions were incorrect, and of course, India and Pakistan have different systems to Kenya and Nigeria, and data is collected and stored and accessible to different extents and from different sources, but this is a really useful starting point. I also think Mariam made a really important point earlier in that you can't just take a process that's been implemented in Africa and stick it in Asia and job done. They are very different contexts, and we have gone through a contextualization process in these countries. And this has been really, really useful. It's really helped us understand the differences in terms of data collected, in terms of how data is used in these countries, but also working with different actors in these countries too. It helps us to recognize what's working, where there are perhaps still gaps. And we know there are gaps in these 115 indicators. These will continue to be evolved as time goes on. So in India and Pakistan, work will be completed by the end of 2021. We will be sharing this data on our dashboard again, and we'll be sharing information and documents prior to that where we can. So I would really encourage people to check reall.net/MSI for updates, and we will continue to put things on there. And like in Africa, this is the start of an ongoing process. We'll continue to work with data holders. We'll continue to build on quality and availability, continue to do annual updates. We have wider geographic aspirations as well. We want to work with other other partners, other actors in the sector to take to new countries and to really kind of continue to build on this work. And crowding in others is really, really key for taking this forward. I won't talk about this further, as I think we have really covered the importance of working with others, but I just want to end by highlighting the various actors that have been involved in this work to date. The MSIs are a collaborative project and are far stronger because of this. And we'll just add here the 2 actors we are working with, the 2 partners in India and Pakistan, Impetus Advisory Group in Pakistan and Jana Urban Services Transformation in India. Really looking forward to seeing what comes from the work in India and Pakistan and building on this. And I hope it will continue to be a really useful project and set of data for everyone. Thank you for your time. I'll hand back to Casey at this point. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. There have been so many things that have come through and lots of people in the chat commenting about the importance of the data. Well, now what do we do with it? How do we solve the gaps of the ones we haven't been able to collect? And all of that is really about this process going forward. That's why we're talking to you, why we wanted to go big and talk to many people, and we hope you share it further. And then feedback and communicate with any one of us, because we're all going to be here for a very long time. This is what we do. And we're all interested in improving the data landscape for affordable housing in Africa and clearly also globally. Can I just ask quickly from the group here, any last comments? Chris, any last comment that you'd like to make?
I think the one thing from my side, we've spoken about, you know, the need to take this forward and engage with the different institutions. I think if I had one wish list that has come through over and over again with this exercise is, let's liberate the data in the e-permitting systems. Like, it's there, you know, yeah. we can do it. And that's probably for me one of the lowest hanging fruits from a data liberation perspective going forward.
Okay, thank you. Ilana, any comments from you?
You know, I kind of feel I've said enough, and just really thank you again. It's been really, really great to participate in this.
Fantastic, thanks. Claudio, any last comment from you? All fine.
All fine. I think fantastic work. I think you did really solid stuff here. I think it's an incredible production. I think this has a lot of future, and I hope I can help you with whatever I can to make the thing goes spread and up, so that more institutions really understand the efforts you guys are doing and the institutions involved, and how important it is to support, because everyone will benefit from it, especially the people who are there in the bottom line.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Maria.
Yeah, the only thing I want to emphasize again is fantastic work by the different NGOs, but the NGOs should have as their focal point to increase the capacity to coordinate and disseminate at the national level. So it is not good enough going forward for the NGOs to collect the data on their own, but indeed to make sure that this is done at the national level. We need money for that, we need workshops, we need a lot, but that should be the orientation. Once that is happening, now we can have global spread. But great start, yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. Ben, any last comment from you?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really exciting exercise, and it's been a fantastic thing to be involved in. I think the biggest message for me is that it's easy to see this as a data exercise. I think it is so much more than just a data exercise. I think it is an advocacy tool. It's a relationship builder. It's a brokering piece. it can be used for so much more. And I'm really, really excited to see where this goes over the next few months and years. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And I just want to thank first, like my partners, Reall and 71.4 for working together on this. It's been a great collaboration exercise. And we're hoping to crowd in more players. And so Hofinet and Maria and Claudio, in all of your work, thank you very much for joining us today and for the collaboration on. We are starting to work with some public sector entities. We're very hopeful in Kenya that we'll be able to do that. And I think what's really exciting, that slide 93 that you mentioned, Maria, there's one of those in each of the reports. And it is a sort of, and they're quite similar actually, because as Chris showed, this is the approach that one can take. But there are particular recommendations in each country about what we want to do next. And we're very keen to work with players and really to support local players so that they can champion it themselves domestically. Because I agree with you entirely. That's where it has to happen. And that's where it will be sustainable if it does have that local oomph, that local drive. So thanks again to all of you. Thank you to all the guests who've joined us today and for your participation in this session, but also leading up to this session and the data collection exercises in our constant phone calls. And in some cases, once upon a time, we even met with you in person. But thanks for the engagement, and it is just the beginning. We look forward to carrying on with you and really building up this landscape of information about affordable housing in Africa. Thanks so much. All of the documents are on our websites. We'll have a recording and we will publish that as well. And we'll share that with you over the next few days. Thank you.